focus on the focus on the reception of European philosophy and the creation of histories of Chinese philosophy in the early 20th century. He has taught in the Chinese Studies and the International Studies program of Leiden University, and now he's preparing something about the reception of Heidegger in the People's Republic of China. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I would like to share my screen, and it's currently not possible. So Matilda, could you please? No.
It should work now.
Yes. Okay. It's there. It is. Okay. So thanks everyone for having me. I'm kind of the odd one out here, bringing news from the faraway country of China. But even there, Bergson, Vitalism, all of these concepts were widely discussed, and I will discuss them today and analyze them today from the perspective of politics and cultural politics. I'll have two broad sections, again separated into two smaller parts. So the first is on the impact of Bergson and Driesch in China during the 1920s. One section each on each of these persons. And in the second part, I will talk about vitalism in practice, so to speak, when the Nationalist Party of China, had one of their party members publish a book called Vitalism, and began a so-called New Life movement in 1934 that put some of the principles of this book, Vitalism, into practice. So to give you some background, I'd like to start with the culturalist debates of the 1910s, because they form really the circumstances into which Bergson became controversial and important in China. So the Republic of China was founded in 1912. It was pretty soon it became a very unstable country where local warlords held more power than the central government. And in general, after a few years and several attempts to restore the monarchy by various forces, intellectuals had to acknowledge that the Republican Revolution had basically failed. And they looked for reasons why. And many of them settled on the explanation of culture, so that Chinese culture, Eastern culture, was not suited for this modern form of state of the Republic. And so they, in a very self-orientalizing perspective, they saw Chinese culture as backwards, irrational, selfish, and various other negative terms. They contrasted this with Western culture, which they saw as progressive, dynamic, and modern, broadly speaking. One of the main organs of these debates, so-called New Culture movement, which was against tradition, which fought for the acceptance of Western culture in China, was called the New You, and had the French alternative title La Jeunesse, testifying to the broad and thorough inclusion of China into global streams of information and exchange at the time already. One of the issues here below, in the middle, we see also they had Bertrand Russell on their cover. So many wide range of thinkers was hotly debated in China, often from this perspective of how to renew Chinese culture to have it become more modern. And this was the background into which Bergson became important. At first, throughout the 1910s, but especially early in the 1920s, he was widely read by many different people of many different political inclinations. We even have a special edition on Bergson in the People's Bell journal that appeared in 1921. Some very famous contributors discussed various aspects of Bergson's philosophy, such as the relation between duration and ego, Russell's criticism of Bergson, or they attempted comparisons between Bergson and Buddhist epistemology. But it quickly turned out that Bergson was much more an effective provider of arguments for the conservatives of the time. And we see this very clearly in the debate on science and metaphysics of 1923. So as I said, In China at that time, science, rationality, utilitarian approaches to life were highly regarded as being modern, and Chinese culture was backwards, was generally negatively perceived. And some tried to poke holes into this narrative, so to speak, and one of them was Zhang Junmai, who we see here. And in early 1923, he argued that science, no matter how evolved, cannot solve the problems of life, of the view of life, end quote. So, oops, sorry, wrong button. So the very deterministic understandings of science at the time opened up the flank to use Bergsonian arguments, mostly about intuition and the superior quality of intuition compared to intellect, to argue that it's not just rationality that is good and modern. Even intuition, which many viewed as a native Chinese quality, a quality of Chinese culture, could also be worthwhile to make the country more modern. And with this view that science could not explain everything, Zhang Junmai kicked off a very lively debate that lasted through 1923. And what's important here for us is that opponents of him, so a united front, so to speak, of liberals and the early communists of China, immediately charged that he had received his ideas from the Grand Master of Metaphysics, Bergson, end quote again. So, especially after this point, Bergson was mostly connoted as someone who was on the side of the Chinese cultural conservatives, someone who was critical of the intellect, of rationality, of science, and its possibilities of solving all the problems of life. And Zhang Junmai, who was also very active in Europe, he collaborated, for example, with Rudolf Eucken, a German philosopher of life. Together they wrote a book called The Problem of Life in China and Europe, published in 1922. And he's also the one who brought Hans Driesch to China. So Zhang Junmai originally wanted to invite Eucken, but in 1921, Eucken was already 75 years old, and they admitted that that was, well, it would be too difficult for him to travel all the way to China. And instead, he suggested that Hans Driesch should go and give a lecture tour in China. And that, in fact, took place. So Hans Driesch went to China in 1922, stayed until 1923. He gave a wide range of lectures on his own ideas on Kant, and traveled to many different cities. Here we have a photo of him, although he's barely recognizable, at Peking University, excuse me. And with this, he was following a tradition that was set up a few years earlier of having very famous Western speakers come to China. For example, John Dewey between 1919 and 1921 lectured in China to great success. Bertrand Russell had been in China 1920 to 21. But compared to these speakers, and also compared to Bergson, Hans Driesch was not as influential and popular in China. So I've had to cut out many things on the background of this. There's so much to talk about. But basically, Bergson was almost always brought up in the debates concerning the modernization of Chinese culture, why science was not all powerful, why not everything could be determined by science. And Bergson ran under the header of philosophy of life. That was the name that he was subsumed under with various different speakers. We have touched on this issue. Arnaud François mentioned this previously, that philosophy of life could bring together a wide range of quite different thinkers, and that same thing happened in China as well, both by defenders and by detractors. Hans Driesch, on the other hand, was not as popular, and vitalism, the term, rarely appears in writings from the period. And if I have to venture a guess why that happened, part of the reason is that the relation between Bergson's critique of intellect and the modernization discourse in China is much easier to establish than any link between Hans Liech and that same discourse. So Hans Liech was simply not as, did not fit into the debates that the Chinese were having at that time. He was a bit more technical with his focus on biology. And he also came a bit later to the party. That probably also hurt him a bit. So in the 1920s, Bergson was a huge but also controversial figure. Hans Liech was recognized, but not to the same extent. And keep an eye on time. And with this, we come to the 1930s, make a small jump here. Let's do this. And see how the history of vitalism still became important in China. And that took place in the early 1930s. So the Nationalist Party was the biggest party in China at that time. It was an authoritarian party that was very closely allied with the military. And it managed to unify the country in 1927, and afterwards well, was in power, but still needed to counter the appeal of communist agitation and propaganda. And as part of that effort, one of the high-ranking members of that party, Chen Lifu, published the book Vitalism in 1933. This is a rather odd book, or it doesn't fit neatly into the vitalism we have discussed in the last few days. But there are some, distant echoes, or not so distant echoes, of these European ideas. So one of his basic points, Chen's basic points, is that everything in the universe is made up of elements. This is a rather unusual Chinese term that he's using here. It's not the normal one for elements, but it had been used in that effect previously. So I'm fairly confident that this is what he means. And again, he's not as sophisticated as an academic philosopher would probably be. He is, after all, a party propaganda worker, so to speak. He is a mining engineer by training from the United States, so more a scientist than a philosopher. So not all of these things are as clear as we maybe would want them to be as intellectual historians, but this is how I understand him. So these elements are very important for him, and Chen appears to conceive of them as a material thing. So they are smaller than electrons and atoms, and he is confident that once science progresses, it will discover elements that make up life, basically from the smallest scale. What's also important is that these elements themselves have life and knowledge. So this sounds more like a panpsychic perspective than traditional vitalist ideas, or even Bergson's philosophy along the time. But where it becomes practically important also is that the same principle of elements also functions on larger scales. So every citizen is an element of the nation. And Chen repeatedly stresses that in classical passages that are well known in China as still today, the well-being of the country depends on the self-cultivation of each individual. So what this implies, more that he doesn't explicitly make that point, is a kind of organicist perspective. So the whole is only as good as all of its parts. And well, this brings us to the question, why is this called vitalism? It's not fully clear to me how to answer that question, I must admit. There are some overlaps, so the continuity of life, the interconnectedness of life, there are some distant echoes of these principles. It's also important to know that one of the founding fathers of the Nationalist Party had widely read works of Bergson, or about Bergson, and by Eucken, Eucken. So there was some certain elements were deeply encoded into these more philosophical reasonings about how the country should be governed. And Chen Lifu and the Nationalist Party were probably building on the given popularity of the ideas of Bergson, mostly in conservative circles. So the Nationalist Party, of course, goes without saying, was more of a right-wing party that allied more naturally with the conservatives that I previously mentioned. So they apparently attempted to connect themselves to that discourse. And this, I think, is, again, one of the ironies of this whole thing. So this encompasses, in my mind, very well how this book functions. We see here a graph that shows on top the good, the correct, and below the bad, the deviant. It's like a force diagram of things that drag you down towards the bad. So like desires, lust, greed. But you have to counter that force that's dragging you down and drag yourself up towards the good. So there's, on the one hand, this is almost a scientific diagram, but on the other hand, the making thought sincere and rectifying the heart, these are the classical passages that I've alluded to previously that talk about how each individual is responsible for the welfare of the nation. So it neatly links both the traditional Chinese thought and scientific, or at least scientific seeming diagrams and calculations of forces. So it neatly links both the modern and the traditional. And this, I think, fits very well into how the party wanted to see itself. So they wanted to achieve a modernization without completely giving up tradition. And we find this even more pronounced when we look at the New Life movement, which in many respects is vitalism put into practice. So this New Life movement began in 1934. It was an effort of the party to create modern citizens. This means that modern here means citizens should be diligent, they should be punctual, they should be hygienic, mostly, also. So the the basic framework of thought here is that it's almost a militaristic spirit, so to speak.
Sorry, Daniel. Would you be able to wrap it in 2-3 minutes?
Yes, of course, I can do that.
We will have some time, so you can take free, but just a warning.
Yeah, thank you. I'm almost coming to the end already. So the goal, as I said, was to create these modern citizens. So there was this very modern aspect of work according to the clock, be punctual, don't spit on the streets. Some very minor stuff, but also imbued with the sense that this was the thing that would bring the country forward. And in a time of limited resources and increasing Japanese aggression, there's something to be said to have. So many critics have called this quite ridiculous, have portrayed this as quite ridiculous, but it does follow a certain ideology, and you might not agree with that. So in a way, it makes sense if you take into account that the counter to the Communist Party was still important. So this was a very individualized approach to structural problems, whereas, for example, the communist rivals of the Nationalist Party would prefer these structural solutions. So I think even though it might sound ridiculous that making your bed in the morning would lead to the welfare of the country, I think there's something to be said for the whole framework in its own ideology. And because I seldom have the chance to use many beautiful pictures in intellectual history talks, I have a few here. The first one is that one of those examples, a residence should be tidy. So if you know Jordan Peterson, clean up your room, that's kind of that. Work hard, cut on expenses, don't gamble, smoke or drink. They had these nice pictures for that. So in many respects, the New Life movement fits closely with the philosophy outlined in the book Vitalism. And with that, I will come to my conclusions. So regardless of what we think Bergson meant when he wrote, in China he was used mainly for the needs of the current discourse, and that meant that the criticism of the intellect made him popular among conservatives who were critical towards Westernization. The other parts about evolution were not so important, for example, in China, and barely touched upon. The vitalism of Grieg, on the other hand, failed to attract substantial attraction, mainly possibly because he was invited by one of the more conservative figures, and possibly also because of his biological focus. And finally, the vitalism of the Nationalist Party connected these conservative appeals and I think a certain openness of philosophy of life, and to develop their own concept of individual agency, individual responsibility against the focus on structure of Marxist theory. And with that, I come to the end of my talk, and I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Super. Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniel. I have many questions that I will leave for the end. But just to remark, it's funny how we get to vitalist individualism to Marxism. So, but I will leave the floor for the second speaker, and then we will come back to questions and discussions, and we'll have plenty of time, because I think that my final words will not be ultima verba, but will be just to open the floor for more debates. So the next speaker is Bruno Rattes, and he will treat the question of vitalism directly, and the title is Bergson and Vitalism, a Reappraisal. I already had the pleasure to read Bruno, because I read his PhD and I was in if I remember well. And he did his PhD in São Carlos in Brazil, and now he's a postdoc at the University of São Paulo. And his interests are related to contemporary philosophy of the 18th and 19th century. And his current research is dedicated to the philosophical impact of evolutionism and the life sciences in the period. And he published mainly about Bergson, and he's about to publish in Portuguese, I think, a book that is taken from his PhD entitled The Expressions of Life, As Expressões da Vida, I think, in Portuguese, Nature and Culture in Bergson's Philosophy. I'll leave you the floor.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Very nice to see you again. Thank you, Mathilde, for the organization of the Congress. Is amazing. The initiative is really nice to see old friends like Arnaud and Giuseppe, new friends from the last Penn State Congress, like Mathilde, Joël, Tanu, and new friends that I'm making now. So I'm really glad to be here. So I made a kind of a big text, so I'm trying to. So I want to ask you, Giuseppe, to have mercy of me, you know. But I'm trying to skip a lot of passages here. So, okay. Researchers who make a more or less automatic association between Bergson and the so-called vitalism, notably having in mind creative evolution, are in for a great surprise when they read the critical edition of this book, published in 2007 by Presse Universitaire de France under the care of Arnaud François, based on the analysis offered by Félix Ravasson in his La philosophie en France au 19e siècle, Philosophy in France in the 19th century, supposedly used by Bergson as a reference for the construction of his own judgment on the subject. François is categorical. Bergson cannot be considered in any way a vitalist. And moreover, our philosopher must be understood as an animist, an ancient theoretical lineage that must be distinguished not only from vitalists, but also from organicism, and of course, from mechanism. In addition to Ravason's book, François also relies on Bergson's text on Claude Bernard, La philosophie de Claude Bernard, from 1913, where it is noted the superficiality of doctors and physiologists who use a vital principle. Let's keep in mind that Bergson uses the term superficial vitalism, vitalisme superficiel, as if it would be possible to think of a non-superficial, a truth vitalism. In short, in his precious work of contextualization, François seeks to circumscribe vitalism to its strictly historical dimension, keeping such an unstable concept under control as much as possible in a theoretical position that we could call cautious. It's a medical school with a date and place of birth, and the criticism that Bergson addresses in the first chapter of Creative Evolution to, according to his own terms, the contemporary neo-vitalism of Driesch and Hayek, must be referred to that made of the vitalists of the Montpellier school, expressed not only in the first chapter, but also in a brief passage from a third chapter of the book of 1907, as well as in a text about Claude Bernard. Although, as we will see later, my intention is to, let's say, disorganize the pieces of this theoretical puzzle a little, the surprise we mentioned earlier does not come only from the information contained in the critical edition. The caution by Francois is, I believe, fully justified, and for at least 5 reasons. I will leave aside the designation of Bergson as an animist, but I would like to state a small digression in form of a question. Would he be then a follower of Stahl and even van Helmont, since, as in the case of vitalism, animism also has its historical and geographic scope well defined? Parenthesis closed. Let's go back to the reasons of Francois' cautiousness. First of all, because a critical edition is a contextualization work and not really a study of or a thesis on creative evolution. Second, because Bergson recognized the great influence that Havazon's book had on himself and his generation, as attested by the text in honor of the old master from 1904, Vie et œuvre de Félix Havazon, The Life and Work of Felix Havazon, where he writes that 20 generations of students have learned them by heart. Third, because there are several statements by Bergson that understand the organism as a machine, or that equates life with death. Especially in the lessons in the Collège de France, there's a quotation here, death is perhaps what is essential in life, he states that. Facts that would put in trouble not only a too hasty approach between the philosopher of duration and vitalism, but also with animism. Fourth, because Bergson uses the expression vitalism or vitalist very rarely. And when he does, as in the 1907 book, in the text and in the text of Claude Bernard, it is in an eminently critical sense, rejecting any resemblance of his philosophy to this school of thought. I say eminently critical because not all mentions have this character, as we will see later. And finally, because the very term vitalism is extremely vague and of difficult conceptual apprehension outside the historiographical framing chose by Francois. Even though it circulated in the works of some figures more or less contemporary to Bergson, as Antoine Augustin Cournot and Otto Büchli, besides the already mentioned Havazon and Claude Bernard, its entry in the philosophical scene is more specific, in a more specific way, often served as a detraction, being difficult at certain moments to distinguish it from other theoretical labels no less controversial and confusing, also linked to the idea of life, as Lebens Philosophie, or Philosophie de la Vie, Philosophy of Life, as explained by another participant in this conference, Giuseppe Bianco, in a text entitled Philosophies of Life. Regarding this, let us remember René Berthelot's harsh criticism of Bergson, in whose books the term vitalist appears in the form of an accusation, that is, as an irrational theoretical attitude, whose basis must be referred to romanticism. Though Berthelot also uses the expression romantic evolutionism. In fact, as Roselyne Hay shows, even Barthes, in Nouveaux éléments de la science de l'homme, from 1906, New Elements of the Science of Man, rejects the use of the term vitalist, which first appears in the year of 1800 in the Principes de Physiologie, Principles of Physiology, from Charles-Louis Dumas, later being used as an accusation by Claude Bernard's master, François Magendie, in 1809. Furthermore, in recent and more general studies on the state of philosophy at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, such as the books by Hermann Schnallerbach, Friedrich Beiser, centered on the German scene, Maurice Mandelbaum, and the solid study of Leo Freuler, both investigation the European context in a broader sense, the term vitalism hardly appears, which throws doubts, if not about its importance, at least on its centrality, Cassire's book and about the theory, about the last volume, and the last book of Stephen Galbraith of his 4-book series dedicated to the 20th century, they give attention to the subject, but both ignore Bergson completely. The same can be said about the spiritualist philosophers. Bergson's thesis advisors, Paul Janet, as well as Marie Caro and Charles Pendrell Waddington, to whom the alternative to materialism should not be vitalism, and in whose works the term hardly appears. To keep an example from the same period, from the other side of the Rhine, Friedrich Albert Lang, it should be noted that he mentions the term vitalism only once, and in the first edition, after removing it from his influential Geschichte des Materialismus, History of Materialisms from 1865, book consulted a few times by Bergson. Within the framework of the more general manuals, the Histories of Philosophy of Uberberg, Windelband, who wrote the preface of the German edition of Matter Memory, and Breyer, a nation student of Bergson, also do not address the idea of vitalism. Thus, taking into consideration this state of affairs, François' caution is more than justified. However, I would like to return to the second point and develop 2 ideas. The first linked to the fact that if you understood vitalism in a more broad sense as an anti-mechanism doctrine, we could classify Bergson as a vitalist, as Mathilde did in the first presentation. So I'm going to skip here because she already mentioned that the passages in Time and Free Will, Matter and Memory, that could be associated with vitalism doctrine in a more speculative way. It should be noted that the concept of élan vital was used for the first time in 1899, not by Bergson, but by André Lalande in his La dissolution opposée l'évolution, dissolution opposed to evolution, book quoted by Bergson in Creative Evolution, against the primacy of Spencer's law of evolution, based on the principle of persistence of force and unaware of the facts brought by the law of degradation of energy or entropy. So also this the energetic dimension that could be linked to vitalism, I think, especially in Creative Evolution, should have a special attention, because we could link also this concept with Bergson's vitalism. So I'm going to skip because it's the second idea that I would like to present in a more circumscribed and is more circumscribed, and is related to the passage that Bergson declares himself a vitalist, which seems to have gone unnoticed either by those who do not associate him with such a theoretical label as by those who associate. In the latter group, it should be mentioned, and then I mentioned all the, that's Frederick Berwick and Paul Douglas' Bergson Vitalist Controversy, a book published in 1992, the thesis of Sebastian Normandin, defended in 2005 at McGill University. But there's countless passages dedicated to Bergson. The book also Normandin edited with Charles T. Wolfe about vitalism, scientific image in the post-enlightened life sciences. The text by Olivier Perru in a book about vitalism. The article by He-Jin Han also about, so all this text, and also a text by Charles T. Wolfe with Andy Wong called Return of Vitalism, Canguilhem and Bergson in the Project of Biophilosophy. All these texts, they do this link between vitalism and Bergson only in a conceptual and speculative basis, not textual or material. And it's precisely this aspect that I would like to explore in the last part of my communication. It should be noted also that the older studies from, from the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 30s that linked Bergson with vitalism, they understand vitalism in a really huge frame, like aesthetic vitalism, ethical vitalism, religious vitalism, so not only epistemological, biological. So it's a really difficult, so we have to do it in a speculative basis. So my intention is to like inspiring and Bianco's nominalism. I'm trying to be attack myself with the term. So the first occurrence that I would like to draw attention is a conference of Phantoms of the Living and Physical Psychical Research, given in 1913 at the Society for Psychical Research in London. So T.S. just talk about it, so I'm going to skip. There's a huge quote by Bergson here that he attests this vitalist biology based on a spiritual suggestion, which is really like a, how can I say it, extravagant. So after this passage in Phantoms of the Living, so 2 years later, however, in 1915, in a letter to Harold Hoofden, Bergson is much more prudent than in 1913 in the Phantoms of the Living, classifying in his own words the vitalism of pre-revolution, it's his own words, to the identity between life and duration, namely, and I quote, that life develops a history that is a succession in which there is no repetition, in which every moment is unique and carries in it the representation of the whole past. This idea, according to him, would have begun to find some resonance in some biologists, although they are generally, and I quote him, so little receptive to vitalism. End of quotation. Bergson does not specify who such biologists would be. But it is in another correspondence of July 4, 1911, this time with the American philosopher Arthur Lovejoy, that Bergson calls himself a vitalist in an explicit way. As we know, Lovejoy, an ancient student of Joseph Royce and William James, is the author of The Great Chain of Being and was an attentive reader of Bergson's philosophy, having written several articles about the French as well as about Driesch and vitalism. The letter, Bergson's letter, is a response to two articles that were sent by the American, one of which is entitled The Meaning of Vitalism, that according to Bergson, I quote, extracts the essence of vitalism with perfect clarity. And I continue quoting, as you well noticed in your conclusion, this is Bergson talking to Lovejoy, a position such as mine may well be called vitalism if we start to agree on the meaning of the word. I reject vitalism only if it intends to constitute all living beings as an independent entity. End of quotation. But in addition to this explanation that rejects life understood as an independent entity, which links to the creative evolution's critique to vitalism. What is the definition given by Lovejoy that Bergson considers so precise as to recognize himself in it? So Lovejoy's article was published in an American journal, Science, also in the year of 1911, and is, in fact, an answer to the text called The Controversy Between Materialism and Vitalism, Can It Be Ended?, published in the same journal a month earlier by the American biologist William Emerson Ritter, R-I-T-T-E-R. According to the testimony of Ernest Mayr, Ritter is the first in his 1919 book, The Unity of the Organism, or the Organismal Conception of Life, to use the word organicism to refer to biological entities. So Ritter begins his text referring to what will be irreconcilable division between materialism and vitalism. The former, understanding that all biological phenomena are to be explained based on the material elements by which organisms are made, and the latter, of difficult apprehension, being understood more as a reaction to materialism, although it would be possible to define it as a position that considers that life inaugurates something non-material. However, and this, according to Ritter, cannot be ignored by biologists, although it belongs to the field of philosophical biology on its own terms, Both terms are philosophically fragile. In a curious analysis, especially for scientists that considers epistemology from an anthropological point of view, reader understands that both materialism and vitalism have their origins in primitive beliefs. Materialism is in magical thinking, has magical roots, and vitalism in animism has animistic roots, both assuming the existence of something to explain certain observable phenomena, while the material and the non-material on which each of these explanations are based, in reality, do not exist, or at least have never been observed directly.
No, being full of generosity. But can you let's say 5 more minutes? We will have some time, but just to give you a warning so you have an idea of the time. The 20 minutes should stop.
I have 2 pages to read. Can I think it, okay, cool. So I'll leave the last page here. So okay, so considering that biology is more perhaps than another, this is reader talking. Other class need a regenerating touch of Bergson's evolution créatrice, in which evolution means indeed something new coming on every moment. There is not a threat, physical or spiritual, of ours that is wholly finished off and a standstill. Reader proposes, in a kind of transcendental dialectic of the ultimate constitution of life, that we abandon both materialism, which he equates with mechanism, and vitalism, since the sophisticated thinker, it's his own words, differs from the untutored savage, because he apprehends the fact that, and I quote Reader, the universe is perpetually in the throes of creative evolution. So the limitation of knowledge in face of the mystery is this expression, due to this unpredictable reality of the universe, especially on the living world, and the refusal of dogmatism that seek to enclose in a single explanation the nature of life, is the lesson, according to Ritter, to be drawn from Bergson's thought that could answer the question that gives the title of his text, and end once and for all the controversy between materialism and vitalism, which is nothing more than primitive beliefs on which men rely to avoid the inevitability of change. Lovejoy's response to Ritter's article is quite critical, and the philosopher does not shy away from pointing out the scientist's naivety, whose positions are characterized as ad hoc definitions. Let me see if I can. Lovejoy distances himself from Ritter's text and exposes his opinion on the subject, pointing out 3 topics that he considers essential to the controversy. The first concerns the identification of the contenders. So he characterizes the 2, mechanism and vitalism. 2 examples, I'm jumping here. 2 examples from each school offer. So the German pathologist William Hu, for the mechanicist position, and in the case of vitalism, Lovejoy indicates not a scientist, as in it was the case of Hu, but a philosopher, Edward von Hartmann, a pessimist Schopenhauerian, author of the philosophy of unconsciousness. So he's kind of, putting these 2 extreme ways of what mechanicism and vitalism to his own terms. So I'm gonna. Yeah, how much time do I have? 3. Oh. So okay, I'm going to continue reading. So for who? Okay, so Lovejoy is asking himself, what will be this reduction of life phenomena to non-living phenomena? So what is this to Lovejoy? The undeductibility of biological from other laws to remain the case of vitalism. So in the case of vitalism will be the non-reductible position. is not simply the undeductibility due to a lack of a specific empirical information called for by those of the laws. What the vitalists maintain is that, even given a complete knowledge both of the laws of motion of inorganic particles and of the current configuration of the particles composing a living body at a given cross-section of time, you could not, from such knowledge, deduce what the motion of particles and the consequent action of the living body would be. What the vitalists asserts primarily, in short, is the doctrine of logical discontinuity at certain points of scientific laws, or scientific autonomism or logical pluralism, while mechanicism would advocate the unification of scientific laws. However, according to Lovejoy, this would be, let's say, a weak vitalism, since such continuity does not imply any violation of the principle of causal uniformity. The behavior of the bodies would still be understood as a function of the number and the configuration of the material particles that compose them. A way of proceeding, by the way, that could be adopted in other forms of epistemological autonomy, either by chemistry in relation to physics or by psychology in relation to biology. Lovejoy does not indicate the representativeness of the weakened version of vitalism. But if there's a weak vitalism, it is assumed that it's a strong vitalism. And here Lovejoy is much more comprehensive in his characterization. Such a more radical version implies that the action of the living bodies is not strictly a function of the numbers and configuration of the particles composed. In other words, organisms not only have unique laws of their own, but these laws cannot even be stated in terms of the number and arrangement of the organism physical components. I'm finished. So in this strong vitalism, he's divides in three subgroups, which he calls biological philosophers, although he admits that perhaps none of them would gladly accept to be called vitalist. So the first group will be it's called qualitative energetism. It's linked to William Ostwald and Eugenio Dingano, an Italian philosopher. The second group is he calls psychovitalists, who also could be biological animists that understands life, is characterized by rudimentary form of consciousness. And he gives like obscure German figures like August Pauli, Francais, and Friedrich Strecker. And the and the third figure of the strong vitalist will be Bergson, which he calls the third group will be the new vitalists, Driesch and Hayek, that will characterize their philosophies, putting emphasis on the empirical proof of a vitalist, of a vital principle, and separate. He puts Bergson as a radical vitalist that will, based on a creative efficacy of organic evolution, a psychological effort beyond that thought by the new Lamarckians, and that could be linked to psychoanimists that he quoted before. So I think that's it. There's a conclusion about science and philosophy, but I don't think I have any time. So I'll just, do I have any time? No.
Well, I would say that we can discuss about it in the general discussion, taking the time that we have as well at the end.
Perfect.
But that was extremely rich and interesting. And I think one of the topics that maybe we should discuss at the end that resonate with your talk is all these operations of labeling and putting labels on movements, set of texts, and the way in which we should read it. And Lovejoy is very interesting in that regard, almost some kind of crazy taxonomy with different types of vitalism made me laugh a little bit, because like, and what's the relationship with how he conceived intellectual history or the history of ideas and this obsession with labeling. But I think I will there's already a question in the chat, but I will leave to the audience the opportunity to asking some questions. I have many. if there are some. Yeah, Joel. Yeah, please. Yeah, sure. But you have the mic. You have to.
Thanks, Bruno, for your very interesting presentation. In fact, I have just a very simple question. You said that Lovejoy said that Bergson is a radical vitalist. What is the meaning of the word radical here?
That's a really good question. I made myself the same question. He's not very clear about it. So actually Lovejoy has two texts regarding, so he has this text that is an answer to Ritter, this American biologist. And also he has how can I say, a review of Drisch's book, the Gifford Lectures, the philosophy of, what is the name of philosophy of organism, I think. The Gifford Lectures given by Drisch. And another book from one of those German obscure figures. So in this review, he discusses more, but I think radical because he thinks that it's really weird, because my conclusion will be like, why Bergson saw himself as a radical, because Lovejoy say, okay, you're a radical vitalist, you're based in really flawed elements to defend your type of vitalist. He says that textually to Bergson, about Bergson. Bergson received this text. He wrote a letter saying, oh, it's amazing. I recognize myself in this definition, but it's really, it's weird that Bergson read this and recognized himself as a writer. So he's not even too clear about this definition. So it's regarding that Giuseppe was just saying, that telling about this labels, it's really weird how this labels were passed and has its own history, is as if they're alive by themselves. You know, they have its own history of passages through one figure to another. So it's really confusing to map, but it's really interesting for us to map why people are recognizing themselves, and sometimes is denying the label. So my question would be more like general. He's not really clear. I think it's because he thinks that Bergson, because he sides with Drisch and Heinck, especially with Drisch. He thinks, Lovejoy, that Drisch is the most rich version of vitalism because it's based on experimental facts. So for him, the other kind of versions are not so
reasonable.
good.
So
yeah,
reasonable.
Exactly. So yeah. I don't know if I answered your question, but
yes.
Okay, maybe just to pass to Daniel, because there are two. Maybe you should go Mathilde, because then there are two questions on the.
Yes, but I didn't want to interrupt you. I was just asking a question for Bruno, but I think you wanted to.
No, go for it. So we gather questions.
Okay, sorry, I didn't want to. Just you talked about the fact that André Lalande used the phrase élan vital before Bergson, and actually in his vocabulary of philosophy of Lalande, he actually, there is this entrance élan vital, and there is a footnote expressing the fact that he wrote it first, and that it's not just a Bergsonian concept, and it's like a kind of a big text for just I think what is just a one. He just uses this phrase once, I think, Lalande, and so yes.
Yes.
And so I was actually wondering, do you think there's a real continuation, like Bergson really read that and think there is something in Lalande that inspired him for his own conception of élan vital, or it's just a fact, it's just a phrase that's been used before, and
No, I think it's really strange that Bergson does not mention the use by André Lalande. I think it's really weird, because it's really a key, and it became a key concept in Bergson's philosophy when he was alive. So and he quotes the book when he discusses the entropy law. So it's really weird that he doesn't quote. But I think maybe being like comprehensive to Bergson, I think that because his use of the term is the opposite of Lalande's use. Because for Lalande, actually the entropy is the universal law that is impossible to be stopped. So he's criticizing Spencer's law of evolution that didn't account the entropy to think of living beings. So he's saying no, Spencer's is wrong because of this. So we can state life as élan vital, but has no force against the degradation of universe. And Bergson is using exactly the opposite sense. The reality that it's done by the reality that is undone. There's this passage that he states. So I think he uses I jumped completely the discussion about the entropy in the French scene. It's huge. So among Dastre, for example, who wrote La Vie et la Mort, there's a huge discussion about that. He was a Claude Bernard's student. So if you get Pierre Durham, I don't know, Hay, for example, a lot of Émile Merson, all the French epistemologists were discussing this topic. So I think Bergson is well aware of these discussions. And to excuse Bergson, I would say that he doesn't mention Lalande's élan vital because he's using a different fashion. But it's really strange that he does not make a reference of this concept in Lalande. I don't know if I answered.
No, it was pretty much my
Do you
question.
agree?
I always wondered what was the actual connection between the two, like why Bergson didn't say a thing about it, and is there a real continuation if he doesn't refer to it? I didn't notice that it was in the same book. I didn't make the connection that he actually that it's the same book. He quotes Lalande, and that uses the concept élan vital. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. As all of us scholars, also Bergson was un petit malin, as we say in French, or as smart as. So quoting people where is not needed and quoting them, I mean, just inversing where is needed, you don't quote it. When it is, you put it, whatever. So we have 3 questions on the chat for Daniel. So the first one, maybe I should gather the 3, so then you try to respond to all the 3. The first one is from Jonathan. I was wondering if you knew why Chen Lifu's book was translated as Vitalism. Presumably it wasn't his own choice, or was the title he used for his book the same as the Chinese used to refer to Bergson and Rich? And then another question from Boram Yong. My understanding is that there is a long tradition of East Asian vitalist philosophy centered around the notion of, I think it's QA, vital force, life energy. Could you speak about how Bergson's vitalism has interacted with or integrated into the Q-based ontology in modern China? And then finally, a question always for Daniel from Katerina. Was Bergson ever invited to China? Did Chinese philosophers know Bergson through the filters of Driesch and Eucken, or directly?
Okay. Thanks to everyone for those questions. I'll start with Jonathan. That's a good question that I thought about myself. Why was the book called Vitalism? I think it was his own choice, I believe. He was writing for the party, but he was so important that I don't think he was directed to that extent. But well, this is very hard to tell. What I can say is the characters he used in this book were sometimes used, but rarely, to refer to vitalism. Was a different term that I think was more common. And vitalism was more connected to Driesch than to Bergson. So I think the reasoning possibly behind this book, I can only hypothesize, of course, was that it was a term that well suggested Bergson and Driesch, but wasn't overly used, so it wasn't really bound up with anything too much. The other thing is that the alternative I mentioned would be philosophy of life, but I think that was already fairly commonly used, and for reasons of the content of the book, having the focus on life, not human life. So this is only someone who knows Chinese. This would be too much to explain the construction of the title. But focusing more on life, as the term vitalism does, also in the translation, of course, fits into the philosophy of Sun Yat-sen again, who had said that life is extremely important. So there are a number of minor reasons, I would say, why this would be preferable, but I cannot give you a definitive answer, of course. He doesn't discuss why he chose that title. Second question about the notion of qi, vital force. The way I see it, so my perspective is that many aspects of many classical passages, mostly from the Book of Changes, talk about life. It's this character Shang. The character life, not so much the character of vital force that matters for the reception of vitalism in China. So there are many passages that state that life is the great virtue of heaven and earth, for example, something like that, or ceaseless generation that is changed. So the character life is very important in the Book of Changes. I think that is something that the 1920s interpreters of vitalism refer back to. The notion of qi, of vital force, I've rarely encountered that. It does play a role, of course, as in many philosophical elaborations, but it's not the central one. It's really the character for life that is important. And I would also add that, well, I would be wary about calling this a vitalist philosophy, because this is, it can be interpreted as such, but this is only something that came up in the 1920s and was then assimilated to the current Western concept of vitalism. So I would be careful with calling this a long tradition of vitalist philosophy. And for the last one, Bergson, I don't think he was invited, but he was not only known in the filtered version, so his works were translated throughout the 1920s. Many of the introductions, there were some more academic, serious introductions to him, also in the Bergson journal that I mentioned in my presentation. So he was known to the Chinese readers in his own words, lengthy citations, and from 1920 onwards in his own translations. Many of his books, a surprising number of them, were translated in the 1920s. And so he was often discussed in relation with Eucken, for the reasons I alluded to earlier, because of philosophy of life as an overarching concept. But he was known in his own voice in China, so to speak, even though he wasn't invited to the country. I hope that answers these questions.
Thank you. If I can just add a remark, it's Eucken is a very not interesting figure in itself. I find it ultra boring, but as the space concerning the space that he occupied, the different spaces he occupies as corresponded with Bergson, as I think the mentor of Scheler at a certain time, for the multiplication of adjectives and usage of the term life, but he doesn't really fit into the category of philosophy of life. I mean, as we conceive, like inspired by the life sciences, but he's a very interesting figure as well as a thinker that was very, very famous at that epoch and completely was wiped away by the waves of history, let's say. If I can add, before coming back, because there was another question to Bruno, I think, unless it disappeared. But I had a question for you. I was just very curious because I have a project on the international congresses of philosophy, global congresses of philosophy at the beginning of the century, and as well the mobility of philosophers and intellectual in Europe, but as well East and West. And I was wondering when this wave of conferences and invitations of European philosophers to China began, and if there were as well, let's say, novelists, scientists, and so on, or yeah, it's very simple, just factual question.
So novelists, yes, but Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, I think is his complete name, the Indian writer, he went to China, was received quite warmly. Other writers, I'd be hard pressed on that. I'm not sure, but it was quite common to have European instructors, lecturers of all sorts that even some of them worked in China for a long time. So there were European, American scholars, academics who worked in China for extended periods of time. The cases of Dewey and Delitzsch, for example, those were just lecture tours. I think the ones I mentioned, those are the most famous ones. But there were others as well that I'm probably not aware of. So the exchange was very broad. It was a broad basis of exchange between Europe and America and China.
But it did. Sorry, but it did start after World War One, so or even before.
There were lecturers, so people who worked in China even before that. I think that goes back to the early 1910s when efforts were made to modernize the education system. Mm-hmm. But as far as I can tell, the big shots like Delitzsch and Dewey, that was something that came only after the war, as far as I'm aware.
And I don't want to monopolize the floor, but the other question concerned the perception of philosophy or a philosopher and the space of philosophy in the organization of the disciplines in China. How was it? Because of course, most of the philosophers, even nowadays, are not underlining enough how this term is used in many different ways. I mean, the term philosophy in the 18th century was knowledge, whereas during the 19th century, it transforms itself in something different. So I was wondering how these people were perceived. I mean, these European thinkers were perceived basing this perception on the place of a discipline or a set of ideas of what this genre was.
I'm not sure. So is this about discipline or about the people, or is it related? And I'm not sure.
No, because often you perceive as, for instance, in analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, there are a lot of misperception of each other, and as well in reading texts coming from, I don't know, Middle Ages or whatever, modernity, we tend to apply labels on texts, and the labels are coming from our perception that comes from the disciplinary organization of the university, research, etc., etc. So I was wondering if there was a place where a discipline such as philosophy was taught in China at that time.
There was, starting also in the early 1910s. There was what we think of as philosophy was first taught under the classics section. So that would include the Chinese classics. But by the 1910s, there were philosophy departments growing in all major universities, at least in China. And this is something I work on a lot, that these people, the scholars, were writing histories of Chinese philosophy, so to give their own field, well, a place in the Chinese discourse, so to speak, to show the compatibility of philosophy with the Chinese textual heritage. So yes, that was happening on a broad scale. And yeah, I can send you something I wrote up if you're interested.
Please, please.
Just your email address, or I wrote my email address in the chat already, so you can just also write me.
Super. Okay. Are there other questions or remarks? Given that I'm supposed to pronounce the final words or the closing remarks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think there's some questions in the QA from Katerina, and I don't know.
No, but those
I addressed them already, I think.
Yeah.
Well, as far as I can see.
There's the one from Isashi that you responded yourself,
Yeah.
but I don't know if you want to. I can read it, but I just wanted to say that I don't have really final closing remarks, especially given that Bergson is the philosopher of the open and of novelty. So I will not close anything. I can give some lines of force, to use an expression that is weird, to launch once again if there are questions or the discussion. But I have the feeling that there are, I mean, during those 2 days, there are many different things that emerged. I mean, I was not being a Bergsonian, but being someone that worked a little bit on the heritage and history of Bergson and Bergsonism. I was astonished by how you can find very interesting things, both in the history of the formation of Bergson's reflection in the first place. So that field work is not closed, both on the influence of Bergson in spaces that I was completely ignoring, the presence of Bergson in China, for instance, and as well the presence of Bergson in texts, scientific texts, even today, pro or con, but apparently this is still very present. And then the fourth remark would be concerning exactly this problem of the isms or the labeling, and that it happened today that we addressed it for the talk of Arnaud and the one of Bruno. But it's funny to what extent we in philosophy we categorize. It's always a process of stratification of different taxonomies and we put thinkers, texts, authors in different boxes without realizing sometimes that it's as well an operation that is done for both epistemological reasons and for social pragmatic reasons. But it's interesting how it's constantly stratified. So you have a label that is labeling another label and so on and so forth. It's like a matrioscas in a way. But so those are not my final words, ultima verba, as the Romans were used to say when someone was about to die. So you're just reading the last words, but just few suggestions if there are other ideas for discussion in the future. But I think that in any case, for sure the discussion will go on, and I hope that these papers will be published. We have already some ideas, and we regret as well because we went through the different propositions for papers with Gertrudis, Mathilde, and Charles, that were excellent papers that we didn't retain, we didn't keep, not because they were particularly bad, but as well because we didn't have time. So we had to stretch as well and limit, and as well you can imagine that doing like 2 full days of online conference could be very heavy. Each of us being closed in a small room, it's kind of alienated, but we regret that some of the papers were not presented. They were very good as well. So those are words, not final. I don't know if there are other words to be pronounced as well from the other participants and the organizers.
To me, I don't know. I think if no one has some questions about these 2 days, things that maybe have not been cleared before, it may be the time, but I don't think, I think we pretty much answered all the question that was raised. I know that Tis had a question yesterday that he didn't have time to ask, but I don't know if he wants to come back to it.
No, I kind of raised it during my talk, you remember?
Oh.
So it was about suggestion in the quote of Tano.
Oh, okay. So, well, if there is no more question, I think we will have to end this this workshop. And I just want to say thank you to everyone, to the speakers and to the people who attended, because I think it was well, everyone had a really great talks, and the questions were always very interesting. And well, thank you to everyone. It was really nice to have all these Bergsonians or less Bergsonians, but who had something to say about Bergson together through the computer. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
very much.
And there will be an afterlife, hopefully, where les esprits des vivants will gather together, maybe
We'll meet again.
in the same space, not in different space.
Back.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.